So for the first time, she was in kind of my neighborhood. She was in our town. And she reached out to me and said, I hope it's not too late. I would love to see you. I'm in your town now. Bring the grandbabies. And I'm like, of course. Of course.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what has gone under the bridge. If somebody puts that branch out there, this is one short life. Let's grab it and do it.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. Counting down to the upcoming celebration of America's 250th birthday, you'll meet families from each state whose stories are woven into the very fabric of America. Tales of immigration, migration, courage, and community that remind us that when we tell our stories, we strengthen the bonds that connect us. So join me for season 2 as we discover From Sea to Shining Sea, the stories that live in us. This season, as we talk about the different states in the United States and the stories that connect us to those states, there's some stories that are going to be told where people have deep roots in a place and deep connections to a place. And there are some stories where it's just a moment in time that connected you to a place that had so much significance to you. Today's story is the latter. My guest today is Lisa Louise Cooke. She is a genealogy colleague of mine. I've known her for more than 2 decades. She has a podcast called Genealogy Gems, and she's been podcasting for 18 years, one of the very first genealogy podcasts in this space. And I've known her for all this time and associated with her at genealogy conferences, but I have never heard her story quite like I heard her story this time. She shares a really beautiful story of connection, but also a story of disconnection and how hard and messy families can be sometimes, and how if we're willing to listen, there can be some fortuitous moments that guide us back to each other. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lisa Louise Cooke and listen out for her connection to the state of Arizona. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to have this conversation with you and to hear your story. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and with your beautiful new studio. Oh my
I
gosh.
know, isn't it fancy?
I love it.
Well, we are in the middle of, or near the beginning of, actually, doing a whole series about America 250. And just hearing stories about different families from different states and connections to different places across the country. But before we get into your connection to a particular state, I would love to just hear a little bit about your genesis into family history. What was it that got you started, and where did that passion come from?
It goes way back. It's wild when I think about it now. It started with my maternal grandmother, and it was a conversation that happened when I was about 8 years old. And I don't know, but I'm pretty sure my parents like dropped me off to get me out of their hair. And so I was hanging out and staying at my grandmother's house for a couple of days. And I remember it was a very small house, and there was they called it the back room. It was always very dark, but it was a room that they had added on after they had originally built the house. And my grandmother was working in the kitchen, so I went in the back room to entertain myself, and there wasn't much on TV in those days. So I plopped down on the floor, and I was looking at the bottom shelf of this floor to ceiling bookcase that she had. And what was interesting about the bottom shelf was there were all these kind of old, black, dusty scrapbooks that looked very different than all the other books on the bookcase. So I pulled one out and I started looking at it, and I'm thinking, my grandmother was a shutterbug. She took so many pictures, and it would, a lot of them of me. And I'm looking at these people going, who is this? Why are they black and white? What's going on? I mean, I didn't recognize anybody. So I really vividly remember walking down the little hall. Grandma, she comes out as always, flips her kitchen towel over her shoulder. What do you need, sweetie? And I said, who are these people? And how come they're not in color? And she's like, oh, what are you looking at? And she looked at it. Come here. And that was my grandma. She would stop anything in that moment, and you were the center of her world. And she sat me down, and I remember she grabbed an old, sheet of paper off of my grandfather's little end table and starts scribbling Mikolowski. And then she's like, "I'm not sure if that's right." And I'm like, "What?" She says, "These are my people." I said, "I'm your people." And she's like, "No, these are you're my people, but these are our people because this is my mama and my papa and my brothers and sisters." I just remember the look on her face. And she was a little mortified that she didn't know the exact spelling or pronunciation of her mother's maiden name, but she thought it was something like Mikolowski. And, she started to write, papa, and he had an uncle in North Dakota somewhere, and there were 7 brothers, and they were from Germany, and she just and I to this day, I still have that piece of paper. And I looked at that, and I thought, "Well, that's fascinating because I'd like a bigger family, that would be wonderful." I had 1 sister, and and then I looked at her eyes, and I could just see her kind of going back in her mind about this, and I thought, I'm gonna find out what her mom's maiden name was, and I'm gonna find out how you spell it. And it just ignited this fire in me that I felt like I had found something I could give back to the woman that I loved more than anything on the planet and who had given me so much and so much love and so much attention. And, that's kind of what I did. Over the years, I went to libraries back when we did it all on paper from the about the age of 8 years old, off and on, picked it back up big time when Roots came on TV, we were all just passionate about that. I'm like, "I'm already doing this." I got his book and, later got to see him speak, which was amazing, Alex Haley. And really, that all led to eventually realizing this is what I love. This is what ignites a passion in me. And most importantly, because I feel like I could give back to my family and to my grandmother, and I could expand my family. And boy, if there was some way to make this a career, I'd sure love to do that. So I
Well,
did.
you figured that out.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
That's
and that was
amazing.
funny. And that happened because years later, when my kids were in school and in high school and everything, I end up going to the local family history library, had a little more time again to do more research. By this time, we were all on computers and things. And I had figured out how to do a Freedom of Information Act request. And I'd gotten some immigration paperwork that nobody ever had seen in my family of my grandmother's parents who had immigrated from Germany in 1910. And so I went and I was talking about it at the library, and the woman looked at me and she said, "Oh, that is such a gem. Can I make a photocopy and pin that on the bulletin board so everybody can see it? Maybe they could do it." And I remember watching her pin that thinking, I'm going to need a bigger bulletin board because I didn't realize I'd come across something that they didn't know how to do necessarily there. And I could teach people and share at least what I've been learning all along the way. And then a year and a half later, my kids gave me an iPod. I think they called it, yeah, an iPod. And I discovered podcasts. And so I did a search. I thought, wow, anybody could do this. So I did a search on how to make a podcast, found a podcast. I mean, this is back in the day when I launched my show, I was on the front page of Apple Podcasts. There were that few. This is 2007. So it kind of launched from there. Genealogy Gems.
There you go. That is quite the story, and I love not only the story itself, but the way that you tell it, because you have been on a journey that was informed by that day in the back room with your grandma. Where was your grandma living at the time?
She was in Stockton, California, and
Okay.
that's where I was born as well. Living in a little house that they built when they found out that she was finally um, pregnant with my mother, their first child. And, that was a really big deal for them, and they lived in that little house until they passed.
Wow. And did you live near them for most of your growing up years or all of your growing up years?
We only lived in Stockton for a couple of years, and then we moved to Modesto, and, people might know Modesto, California because the Native
Lisa,
American
I grew
graffiti.
up Lisa, I grew up in Turlock.
No, really?
I
Oh
did.
my gosh, awesome. Well, then
Yeah,
you know
I
the
know right
whole.
where Modesto is.
Oh, Modesto, they you'd cruise the McHenry Avenue,
Yeah.
cars. When I was about, probably right after that incident with my grandmother, we moved around, I don't know, 1971 to Washington State.
Mm.
So I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. My kids were born there, and then we moved all of them back to California, to, Central California, and raised our children in San Ramon. So, but the neat thing was even after we moved to Tacoma, which is, what, an 800-mile drive, my grandmother would get in the car by herself and drive herself to come see me if I was gonna be in a play, because I did a lot of theater. And, my grandpa didn't wanna travel, and so she's like, "Well, see ya." And she'd drive all the way straight through and come and see us.
Good for her. That's amazing. How long did you have her with you?
She passed after my, first child was born. Vienna was about 6 months old, and that was amazing 'cause I never forgot. She ended up in the hospital. She'd been a maternity nurse her entire life. She helped deliver me, and, I was determined to get to the hospital when I found out how ill she was, and we were on a plane landing in San Francisco, and the plane got hit by lightning. And I've got my six-month-old baby in my arms, and the fire trucks are coming to meet us on the tarmac, and I'm like, "That's fine, but get out of the way, we're going to the hospital." And, yeah, and then she passed shortly after that.
Wow. So you had her for a long time. A lot of people
Yeah,
don't have their grandparents that long.
yeah, yeah, really fortunate, and so fortunate that she got to meet her great-granddaughter because, my daughter Vienna, I named her middle name Louise. My middle name is Louise, obviously, and my mother's middle name is Louise, as is my grandmother, Alfreda Louise, and we were all named after, well, I thought, her mother. So, Louise Nikolowski, I thought, "Wow, that's a lot of generations." Come to find out through family history research, there's 11 generations
What?
in a row. Yeah,
That's amazing. Wow. Wow, that's really incredible.
and I have a granddaughter with the middle name Louise now. So,
Well, I'm glad they're keeping it going.
yes.
That's so fun. So, you have a little bit of a story, and I don't know the details, so I'm asking this question kind of blind, but like about a rift in the family. And I don't know how comfortable you are talking about that. I often say all families are messy, and they're all kind of messy in their own way. Families have always been messy. That's nothing new. I think a lot of people tend to feel maybe some shame around some of that messiness sometimes. But whatever you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious to know about that story.
I'm fine with sharing it, and I think my parents would be too, because they are all messy, and I think anytime I've shared my own story, then other people go, "Oh, okay, then we're not." Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm alright. There's nothing really bizarre happening to me alone that many, many people go through situations. To say I'm a child of a divorce is an understatement. I'm a child of, I think, 3 divorces. My parents divorced when I was 13. Um, my mother remarried 3 months later. My father remarried about a year later. They all divorced again almost immediately, and, each have now remarried again and are still with their spouses. So, I had 3 divorces by the time I was 21 and getting married that I had lived through. And
Wow.
what happens with divorce, as people know, is, I mean, I'm sorry if this is a radical statement, but no child goes unaffected by
No.
divorce. You can say, "Well, they're gonna be better off because 'cause we're not fighting." Figure out how not to fight if you can, because there is no way you're not finding that the impact on the children is just really devastating in so many ways. And everybody responds differently, and I have such a heart for anybody who has gone through that or is going through that. Um because there is an impact one way or another, as there is with everything that happens in life. But by the time I was getting married, like I say, when I was 21, um, my mother, had gotten very busy with her own life, pretty much after the divorce. They both, I mean, everybody did. I had one sister, a father, and a mother, and they all kind of just went their own way, and I ended up raising myself pretty much through junior
Where were you living at the time that your parents were divorced?
up in Tacoma,
Okay.
Washington.
And did your parents both stay there or did they go elsewhere?
They did, which was a good thing, really good thing. They both stayed there. Um, but I ended up going to work, lying about my age and getting a job at 15 and a half so I could start making some money and be able to get myself around and get a car. And, you grow up really fast when there's nobody at home, you
Yeah.
know. So, and you can imagine with parents that aren't happy with each other, and unfortunately, it was a very unhappy divorce. There's a lot of pressure for the child,
Yeah.
and what ended up happening was I end up kind of um, separated from my father. And that relationship just kind of broke away. My uncle ended up walking me down the aisle when I got married.
Mm.
And, it was just really challenging.
Prior to that, had you been close with your father's side of the family? Did you know those grandparents?
I loved and adored his father. Unfortunately, he died in his 50s
Oh.
on a treadmill taking a stress test for
Oh
to see
my
if he was going to
gosh.
have a heart attack, and he did.
Yeah.
Um, my grandmother was a very, um, I didn't know it at the time. I think you'd call it OCD now. She was very OCD. She was very proper, and we called her grandmother more. And she just wasn't involved. She was the opposite of my maternal grandmother,
Mm.
who was just hugs and kisses and hands on and, the whole thing. Which is fine. I always recognized that she was just a very different person. And they had moved in the 40s from Oklahoma to make a better life in California. And so she was very, very conscious of her home needed to be perfect and they needed to strive to do well. And her son was going to go to college and they were not going to be Okies the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And so so I wasn't close to her, but I have letters. I saved every letter that she ever sent me, and birthday cards and that kind of thing.
That's yeah. It's interesting as genealogists how we treasure those things even when the actual relationship may not be as warm. The artifacts kind of become almost a substitute for that relationship, and we cling to those little pieces a little bit sometimes.
Very wise observation because, if you walked in my home, you'd say, "Wow, how did you end up with all this stuff?" You know, I hung on to things as a kid. You cling to what you can get your hands on if you're losing things. So, word gets out that you're the family historian, and pretty soon, every time somebody passes, everything comes your direction, which is great, and it's amazing for me as a family historian. Um, so I'm fortunate to have many things in my home that belong to people I loved.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's I yes, you are fortunate to have that. Not everybody does.
Yeah.
Some of those things get lost through all sorts of circumstances, and particularly when there's divorce in the family. I think,
Yes.
I've had families or members of my family where the new wife has just thrown everything out, photos and baby books, and it's heartbreaking when you realize the loss of some of those things that, had people just had a little bit more grace or patience, would could have been saved.
Or an understanding that this too will pass,
Yeah.
you know? And, I I often talk about this when I do like a keynote at a conference or something, and I've been saying this for years and that I love to cross stitch. And, I think of family histories so much like a cross stitch and really building your family tree is like a cross stitch or a tapestry. As you're doing it, other people look at it and they go, "What are you doing? What is that ever gonna be?" Because it's all these little X's of color that don't seem to make any sense. And, when you lay it down and they walk past it, all they see is this mess of threads on the back, and that's kind of what life is like. It's all these little individual threads, and the beauty of a family tree is we actually get to turn that over sometimes and see the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, and I love the imagery of that, the tapestry imagery.
Yeah.
I often talk about family history as a jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together without the picture of the box, right?
Yes.
Trying to fill it in. Another analogy that I've heard is the stitching together of quilts, right? Like kind of
Mhm.
some of those crazy quilts with pieces that you're like, you have all these scraps, and how are you ever going to make that work? You have a family story about finding a quilt.
I do. It was, miraculous in many ways, and going back to when I first got married and started having children, I can't even quite remember how this happened, but, I know my grandmother reached out to me, my father's mother, and he had moved her from Stockton, um, again, divorced. Talk about divorce, okay, in my family, we do it creatively. My grandmother divorced my grandfather and married his brother.
What?
And then she divorced him years later, and my father moved her up to Tacoma where he could put her in a small home and have her nearby, and so for the first time, she was in kind of my neighborhood. She was in our town, and, she's reached out to me and said, "I hope it's not too late. I would love to see you. I'm in your town now.
Mm.
Bring the grandbabies." And I'm like, "Of course. Of course."
Yeah,
I it doesn't it doesn't matter what has gone under the bridge. If somebody puts that branch out there, this is one short life. Let's grab it and do it. So, I went over and started visiting with her, and each time we'd visit, she would pull out a couple of photos, a couple of more photos, and I got the sense I think she was worried I wouldn't come back, so she just trickled them out to me, you know? And she said, "This is your grandfather's chair. We're gonna have to get that to you eventually, and this is my sewing machine, and we're gonna have to get that to you." I'm like, "You don't have to give me anything, it's okay, but I love the pictures. Can I take pictures of
right.
the pictures?" Um, so she started telling me the story of the family, and, um, she was really worried. She relied on my father very, very heavily for everything at this point, and she said, "We can't tell your father that we're meeting. I know that you guys are, you know, I don't even know what the right word is, but our relationship was broken."
Yeah.
And, she said, "I please, I can't have this go back to him." I said, "Don't worry about it. That's okay."
Was she afraid that he would stop you from seeing you? Like,
She was afraid he would be angry with her, I think,
with her?
and that somehow, he had been so loving and so willing to rescue her and
Mm,
put her in a home and had a home built for her and made sure she was safe and secure and taken care of. And I think knowing that she hadn't invested as much in relationships, whether with me or my father or anybody, um, you're not always sure you're on really, really solid footing with somebody, and I think she was
yeah.
very afraid about my father wasn't a violent man or anything like that, he's not.
Sure, but she felt vulnerable.
She felt vulnerable
Yeah.
and, didn't want him angry. She was not an emotional person, and so I said, "No, that's okay." So we visited, and then a couple of years later, I just didn't hear anything, and I waited, and I tried to reach her, couldn't reach her. I thought, "I don't know what's going on." And one day, I got an email from my father. I don't know how he got my email address. And he said, "I just wanna let you know, your grandmother, was moved to Arizona, but she's passed away. We're gonna have the funeral on Saturday, and just wanna let you know."
Just out of the blue.
Out of the blue completely. I
Wow.
didn't even know he'd moved her.
Yeah.
Moved to Arizona.
And where were you living at the time? Were you still in Washington?
At that point, we were in San Ramon, California, in
Oh,
Central
okay.
California, and, this is where you just go, "Oh, I have an amazing husband." I came out of the room and I was crying, and I said, My grandmother passed, and my dad reached out to me, and I said, "I'd really like to be there."
Yeah.
He's like, "Done. We're doing it." I said, "We have these 3 kids," and then he's like, "We have a Suburban. We're gonna pack it up. We can drive straight through. We'll be there in time." And we literally did just that, drove straight through, and I remember, at the cemetery, they were at the graveside. she didn't know anybody there, so it was basically my father and his wife and the minister and maybe a neighbor. And, I came walking across the grass, and I could hear it was like everything went quiet, and I could hear my father say, "That's my daughter."
Oh.
And I thought, "Well," he didn't say, "Oh, no." So I just kept walking,
And your husband and kids were in tow
and my
too?
husband and my kids are coming behind me, and, I just hugged him, and we were quiet, we finished the service, and, he said, "Wow, I'm surprised you're here. I'm so glad you're here." And I said, "I'm so glad too." And he's like and his wife, who's adorable, came and said, "Well, we're gonna have, just a small little, get together her home. It's just down the road here in Arizona, and, why don't you join us? Come and join us. Do you have time?" I said, "Yes, of course." We just literally rolled into town. And so we went to her little house, and it had turned out that they had bought, a winter house. I guess they're snowbirds, so they had bought a house in Arizona, which is the connection as to how they ended up buying this little house so that they could have it next to them, from my grandmother. And, we went to the house, and it was a surreal experience because all this stuff that I recognized.
Mm.
I remember it so clearly from the house on Princeton Street in Stockton so many decades before. And, I saw this cookie jar up on the refrigerator, and I said, "Oh my gosh, there's her cookie jar." And his wife, Claudia, is like, "Oh, well, you need to take that. She's your
Oh.
grandmother. You need to take that." And I said, "Are you sure?" And, "Oh, yeah, yeah." And, and I said, "Oh my gosh," and, she had these silver canisters for flour and sugar and still as pristine as the day I remember is her getting them. And so pretty soon she's like, "Well, you should take that." And she's like, "Lisa, if you have a few minutes, you should go through the house and see what you want." She said,
Mm.
and my father walked by. He says, "Yeah, because whatever you don't want, we're putting in a garage sale. It's gone." And he walked on. And I said, "Okay." And I looked at my husband and he's like, "I'll get the U-Haul." And I did. He got a little trailer, hooked it up to the back of the Suburban. And, I walked around the house and I got grandpa's chair and, the little the little portable sewing machine that she had and some of her stuff. And as I was walking around, I ended up in the master bedroom. And I had this intense feeling she was there with me. And the whole time we'd been visiting, my dad and I were doing this back and forth in the hallways in the living room, but we hadn't spent any time together. And I had this I could almost it's like a voice, but you can't hear it, but you know it. She's saying, "You need to find it. You need to find it. It's here." And I was like, "What?" So I'm looking and looking, and there's nothing under the sink in the bathroom. There's nothing under the bed. I'm looking around. There's really nothing heirloom wise in the room. Um, I ended up finally opening the closet and I see all these dresses. She's kept every beautiful dress she's had since 1955 and all the shoes and everything. And, but it's not stuff that I can use. She was a tiny little thing. And, I wanted to close the door and I just had this overwhelming, intense feeling. I almost wanted to cry. I felt like I was failing and I didn't even know what I was looking for. And my dad walked in. Now, this is the first time that we've ever been alone together since this happened. And he's like, "Did you get everything?" I said, "I don't know, but I have this distinct feeling there is something I'm supposed to be getting, and I don't know what it is, and I can't find it." "Really? Have you been through everything?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." He says, "What about the closet?" And we open up the closet, and I'm looking at all his clothes. I'm like, "Yeah, no, I don't need any of these clothes." And there was a bunch of suitcases along the bottom. He's like, "Well, what about these suitcases?" And I said, "Well, I mean, I lifted them. And you can feel that they're empty." And he went and reached and picked one up. He says, "This isn't." And I said, "What?" I thought I literally picked them all up. I guess I gave up because they were all just empty suitcases from the 40s and the 50s. He says, "Well, let's see." And he pulls it out and plops it down on the bed and opens the latch, and here's this crazy quilt that's been pieced together, and you can see almost immediately it's, like flour sack material, right? From the 20s and the 30s. Beautiful colors, but it's not fancy stuff. It's not new. This is an old pieced together in the crazy quilt style. And I almost burst into tears. I was just like, "Oh my gosh, that's what it is." My grandmother didn't quilt or anything. I'd never seen this quilt in my life. And I started to lift it and I hear this rustle and I turn it over and there's a note pinned to it. And I printed it out. I don't have it. I was going to read it to you. Um, this quilt is for Ronald L. Moore. It is the last quilt his grandmother Herring made before her stroke and death. She loved him so much. I love you so very much, Ron. I'm so proud of you as a son. All my love. Mother Moore. Classic, my grandmother. And he looks
Probably never said those words out loud to him, did she?
never, I'm sure
Yeah,
never.
yeah,
And, she thinks she has to put Mother Moore, like just in
yeah.
case. But she was grandmother Moore. Anyways, so he looks at me and I look at him. I said, "Well, you should have this." And he starts to unpin it. And he says, "You take the quilt. I'll take the note." I said, "Okay." And then we just started talking and sharing and reconnecting. And I absolutely 100% felt and understood that she desperately wanted my father and I to reconnect and to love each other. And that would be her final legacy. And really, it was my great grandmother's final legacy because she made the quilt. And I could just sense from my dad in that moment that he understood it too, even though he's not an emotional guy and he was just totally understood it and he wanted the note. So it was an amazing, amazing time. And it just reminded me something that my mother always used to tell me, which is you need to listen to the voices in you and you need to know and you trust your instincts. You trust your instincts. And I always learned that as a girl, but it applies in so many ways. There's so many ways, that our ancestors want to speak to us. And the noisier we are, and the more determined we are to get our way, we can't hear anything, you know? So
Yeah.
it was
Wow.
a wonderful lesson.
Okay, so I'm weeping.
Okay. Thank you, because I keep
I suspect you probably shared this story enough that you were able to get through that, but,
oh,
that was beautiful, and the fact that you were so persistent in listening and following those promptings meant that you were able to have that experience with your dad, which had you brushed them off or ignored them or not been trained up maybe to recognize them, you might have missed out on that, which is heartbreaking to think about.
our lives would be so different.
Yeah.
I mean, because we're so close now.
Yeah.
We're just so close now, and I don't think that would have happened. I don't know how it would have. You
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Well, what a beautiful moment. So, does your dad still live in Arizona?
He splits his time with he and his wife between Arizona and Washington State. So we get to go back and forth in between the 2, and yeah.
I love that. It's interesting because as we think about this, talking about different states, like some people have deep, deep roots in places and they're connected to the land and the dirt and the earth and like all of that. But some people, like it's just things like what you experienced, like you experienced a life changing moment in a place.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me that that place was your grandmother's house, surrounded by familiar things, but in a new and unfamiliar place. and yet now you have this connection to that place that's a little, different than maybe somebody who lived there their whole lives or went visiting grandma there every year their whole life. As you think about, you know, Arizona, it's interesting to think about it as a place that has significance to you when it is not really part of any other part of your family history story, right?
Mm. Well, and Arizona was a place, growing up in California, you probably did this too. It was all about car trips. We definitely went there on vacation as kids. And it's interesting because a couple of years ago, um, I got a call from my stepmom, Claudia, and she said, "We're in Arizona and your father is sick and he's in the hospital and I'm afraid we're going to lose him and I think you probably need to come out." And uh, of course, my husband, "We're going. Let's go." And so we did, but this time from Texas, and we got there and I think about how he kind of rescued my grandmother and how that really had an impression on me because he served her and he was so selfless in that. And, we just dropped everything. I had a lot of stuff going on with Genealogy Gems and stuff, and we just dropped it. We drove out there, and I think following kinda his example, and we get to the hospital, and they're pumping him up with morphine, and they're about ready, let him go. And he had, a severe, severe case of Ramsay Hunt syndrome, which is a horrible kind of internal shingles that affects
Mm,
all your nervous system, and it's like having a stroke, but the pain is just intense. And anyway, my husband, who had been in hospital administration for years and years, kinda knew how the system worked, and he started raising Cain, and he started getting an advocate, and he started, working the levers, and, we very quickly got him some new care, got him on a new plan. um Eventually, we're able to move him while we stayed there about a week. We were able to get him stabilized enough to get into a, full-time nursing facility that could deal with his ongoing chronic condition because it was gonna be a long haul, and, he had a lot of different complications. And anyway, it was amazing because they have an amazing medical, community there in Arizona for a lot of retirees, and I just thought, how appropriate to be coming back here and to help him, and now he's back to playing golf 3 times a week, and, you'd never know, but, I mean, it was a year, year and a half, recovery, and the hardest part was that as he's coming out on the tail end, I had to call him and tell him I'd been diagnosed with breast cancer, and that was a year and a half ago, and, that was probably the first time I ever heard the tears in my father's voice, and he's telling his wife, I can't talk, I can't talk, I can't talk. You gotta talk to her, you gotta find out what's going on."
oh,
And, so I end up going through I had a really nasty form of breast cancer and, ended up having to do chemotherapy. It was kind of a mandatory part of the whole thing. And, a side note, kind of another connection with my grandmother is that one of the things I was doing 6, 8 months worth of chemotherapy, and it's, every 2 weeks. And one of the things that can happen with the type that I was having is that it can settle in your fingers and in your feet, and
mm,
neuropathy is a huge, side effect. And so one of the things they do, and my doctor said, "I want you putting ice mitts on your hands and ice socks on your feet." I'm telling you, that's harder than chemo
right?
because it takes several hours to get through the whole chemo infusion each and every time, and, it's bad enough that all your hair is falling out and, you're just losing all your energy, but then my hands are freezing. Um, anyway, so weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of doing this, and one day I looked down at home, I was laying on the couch. I said, "My ring is gone. My wedding ring is gone." And somehow along the wedding, I was pulling those things off. The moment the infusion's done, I'm pulling them off, going, "Oh my gosh." And somewhere along the way, I pulled them off and the ring was lost. my wedding ring. And, we searched and searched in the infusion center, but I didn't know how many weeks had gone by. I was so out of it. I'd gotten really deathly ill at one point in the hospital, and they had to pull me back from that, and that was when I realized, "Oh my gosh, this ring is gone." Well, for my birthday this year, now that I'm just hit the one-year mark of recovery, and I am declared cancer-free from my doctor, which is amazing, um, my husband took my grandmother Moore's wedding ring, which my father gave me after we reunited, and I'd had it, but I've lost a lot of weight since I did chemo, and I couldn't wear it, and it would spin around in my hand, and, anyway, he went and had it's a band, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a band and an engagement ring that were put together. He had another band made, identically custom made to match the first, so it was bonded on either side
Oh,
and had it resized, and so that is my wedding ring now.
that's so lovely. I love that so much.
Yeah.
What a gift. I mean, just you are a gift. Your story is a gift. I so appreciate you sharing it with us. I think there's a lot of people who will resonate with a lot of what you've shared. At different points. Um, I think sorry, I'm an emotional mess. I cry
Oh, I'm
like,
sorry.
nobody cries alone in my presence. That's kind of my general rule in life. Um, I've just been so touched by the fact that you feel and recognize your grandmother and the fact that you and your father have been able to heal the rift that was between you, and I think it's so lovely the role that family and family history have played in that story as well. So thank you for sharing that. I know that that's an emotional and tender thing for you. So thank you.
Well, I have certainly learned through my years and certainly this last experience that, nobody goes untouched. Nobody goes without suffering. Nobody has a family that is perfect. And so, like I say, sharing this story, I just hope everybody, takes heart and knows there's always hope. There's always hope for reconciliation. If there are fragments in families. And one of the things I used to tell myself as a kid was, well, maybe I don't have a whole lot of family like here with me now, but I found some super cool people and records who are all my family
Yeah.
and were so brave and just didn't, and went through a lot harder things than I did. So, um, to me, that everybody can benefit from the great comfort of knowing, oh my gosh, you can expand your family. And by learning about them, it was interesting. I often say, when my dad and I got together in the living room and really sat down and then finally started to talk, he wanted to know what I knew about the family history.
Mm,
So when you don't have anything else in common with your family, you do have family history in common, and that can be the
yeah.
bridge.
Yeah. Yes. So beautifully said. Well, your story is, it's so interesting because as we were looking at different people and their stories to connect with different places, this pivot moment that you had in Arizona was so touching that I wanted to connect you with Arizona, but really we could have connected you with Oklahoma or California or Washington. um, but
Like so
as
many of us.
Right, yes, exactly, right, which
Yeah.
I think very few of us are all from one place.
Right.
There are those, but I think it's more common, that the American story is one of migration, both immigration into the country and migration around the country and people coming together. And even, like you with your family moving from Washington to California to Texas and your dad, going back and forth between, Washington and Arizona. Like, I think that that's a common story for a lot of people. But to kind of ground it back in Arizona as we wrap up, as you think about Arizona, and maybe even particularly about that pivotal moment in your relationship with your dad and your connection with your grandmother, what does that state mean to you?
It means hope, you know? That's what I think of when I think of that state. I think of the hope of reconciliation. I think of the hope of healing. And I'm really pleased that my dad has hung on to his house. He was talking about moving to a different place, but he's like, "No, I'm hanging on to the Arizona house." I said, "Good, because we enjoy going back there, and, a lot of really nice people out there."
Thank you for spending this time with me and just sharing your story. I just adore you and have seen a part of your heart today, and thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing everyone's stories the way you are. I think this is a brilliant format, and I've been so touched by the ones I've already watched on your YouTube channel, and, I'm just so glad we got to connect. It's never too late.
It's not, absolutely.
Studio sponsored by Ancestry.